Hi, scholars. Today we are going to be looking at our open educational textbook. So if you go to our homepage and you're scrolling down, you're going to see the URL here, and you're going to click that, and it will take you to the textbook here. And we're reading Chapter 3 on Africana, African American, and Black Studies, as well as Chapter 8 on intersectionality and centering women of color. So we're going to start with the first one, which I have opened here, and it's this one. Yay. So let's go back to the first page of it. Let's talk a little bit about Black Studies, Africana Studies, and African American Studies. So the first question you might be having is, what is the difference between the terms? And before we get there, I just wanted to show you the first part of the chapter, which gives you the learning objectives. So analyze and articulate concepts, apply the theory and knowledge, critically analyze intersections of race and racism, describe anti-racist practices, explain and assess how struggle, resistance, racial and social justice, solidarity, liberation is enacted and studied by Black communities. So what I was talking about was the terms themselves, and it's really important to understand the differences, nuances between these all. So the authors here talk about the terms in this paragraph. So they say that Africana and Black studies refer broadly to the experiences of people with African heritage throughout the world. African American studies are explicitly focused on the experiences of people whose family lineage includes African peoples who were enslaved in the United States. And in terms of the terms that they're going to use in this chapter, they really stick with Black studies. And in terms of our own classes here at LMC, we use Black studies because we want to look at the global construction of Blackness throughout the world rather than being limited to the U.S. perspective. And I think that it's really important to note here that Blackness can also be attributed to people that are maybe don't trace their lineage all the way to different African countries. Kind of depends. It's a very complicated terms. There's people within other communities of color that are very dark skinned and can be called Black even though they're not. And then you have interracial or multiracial experiences with Afro Latinx and maybe those in the Caribbean and other Latin American places in which there is some mixing in terms of experiences with Latino, or African American, or Africana, or Black studies. So I think it's really important to understand the differences and the nuances in these terms. And I would say Black studies in particular has a history with our area, considering what happened at the time San Francisco College and the demand for a Black Studies department. So you might see Black Studies used most often in the Western Coast. So when you go to 3.2, they give you some information about the beginnings of Black power and Black nationalism. Black nationalism has also come up in our racial formations textbook, and it's really the ideology that emphasizes pride in being Black, economic self-sufficiency, and even Black separatism, which is very different from segregation based on race. A community choosing to be separate is different from a community forced to be separate. And they take you pretty far back in the historical trajectory. So oftentimes with ethnic studies, you'll start right in the 1960s with the Third World Liberation Front and movements at And here they're giving you more of his historical trajectory with Marcus Garvey, and specifically talking about this pretty important term called Pan-Africanism. Again, this has been emphasized in our racial formation book, which is an ideology that emphasizes pride, empowerment, and economic prosperity for Black communities. And if you scroll further down, they give you a little key box here that talks about the Black Power movement, which was coined by Stokely Carmichael during a speech he gave after being arrested for the 27th time in 1966. And this is the time period that I'm referring to, which can often be a starting point for ethnic studies and Black studies in general. But it's really important for you to see this historical trajectory because Black studies didn't just come into fruition during the Civil Rights Movement. And then here, as you're going down, you're going to see the Pan-Africanism term that I was talking about. And this is the coming together of African people, African immigrants, communities with origins on the African continent that have been enslaved, trafficked, and settled in various parts of the world, especially in the United States, the Caribbean, Europe, and Latin America. And very important in terms of its movement or why it's so important. Pan-Africanism is about the coming together and the demand for social change and social justice, especially as it relates to racial justice. And so as you continue on, you're going to see a little bit of historical trajectory about what was happening prior to the civil rights movement with the Jim Crow laws, racial segregation. There's the notion of separate but equal, and you might be familiar with a lot of the images in which it says drinking here, a drinking fountain here is for whites, and this is for quote colored peoples. And the fight against that mentality, you see Martin Luther King Jr., you also have Malcolm X really speaking up against this, and then you have the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, which also played heavily in the changes because they had sit-ins, which is when you refuse to leave an area, freedom rides, voter registration drives, especially important when voter suppression was occurring, and voting suppression is something that is still occurring today. And then the Freedom Democratic Party and Fannie Lou Hamer is talked about a little bit here as a key person to know in terms of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party that was formed in 1964. And then they do another little sidebar here. And Fannie Lou Hamer would be a great person to honor in an El Dia de los Muertos altar. We're going to go to the next page of the textbook. Now, this is a really interesting one because they backtrack us a little bit, and we've read some of W.E.B. Du Bois's works on double consciousness in terms of quotes within the racial formation book, and especially when you're considering the Chicago sociology group that kind of broke away from the dominant white group of the time. And he has this really important term here, de jure racial discrimination, which is legally codified explicit racism, improved racial attitudes among the general public, and the election of the United States' first biracial Black president. Um, this basically means that racial disparities is legalized in terms of the law, and what makes it really difficult to have systemic changes. The double consciousness that is talked about is in terms of being Black or African American living in a society, in a racist society, and that it has a psychological impact on how you see yourself. And one way to really consider this double consciousness ideology is, I've mentioned the doll test before in class, and it's this notion that the doll test has been repeated and repeated since Brown versus Board of Education, results are still the same with Black children or children of different minority or children of color groups, still identifying white dolls as being the more beautiful or the more desired quality, and that something is happening within the psychological impacts of the groups or the community that is causing this decentering or almost like a self-loathing of one's own ethnic or racial background. And part of that is connected with the what happened in terms of the slave trade. So again, the textbook takes you back a little bit on the pre-colonial Africa and the different nations and before there was even really countries, there were empires and different tribal groups located in the continent of Africa. And then when the slave trade occurs and you have chattel slavery, you see the robbing of the African coast here. And in terms of where the slaves were being taken, you can see it wasn't just the United States. You have slaves coming to Latin America, you have slaves coming to Europe, and of course, the Caribbean as well, along with other types of resources like textiles, spices, and whatnot. And it is this breaking from a historical understanding of one's roots that causes um, a form of genocide to occur within groups of people in which families are separated. They're sold off of auction blocks and their very names are taken away. And I think that this is a really good section to read slowly. There's some comparison with what happens in terms of Native American and Indigenous peoples as well, um, which is mentioned there. And then they do have the sidebar again about voting rights and voting suppression and who was allowed to vote at a certain time period. And then you have a time period that occurs during the history, and you have people like Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad operating to uh, free black slaves and get them out of the South. And this included taking them to Canada and Mexico, not just northern parts of the United States. And so you can see the resistance that is occurring in terms of any given point within the trajectory of the transatlantic slave trade. And I do want to point out that the Reconstruction period here, after the Civil Rights Movement, or after the Civil War, and Abraham Lincoln, quote, freeing the slaves. And I say that in quotes because we know that the Emancipation Proclamation had very little to actually do with slavery and more to do with the politics at the time. But something that does happen that's worth highlighting is this Reconstruction era, in which, for a very brief period, uh, the Bureau was formed. Black people are being elected into office. It seems like the trajectory of the United States is going to change in a very positive direction. And it's a short period because then very quickly, as Reconstruction is happening, different kinds of federal laws come into place because the South realizes that it's losing a major workforce for their cotton um, produce. And suddenly, black codes come in, and it's what we call Jim Crow era. And so we have a brief period of what our society could look like in which black people are slowly gaining rights very quickly in what seems to be very quickly, and then just as quickly it's squelched with legalized racism, basically. And then you have things like Plessy versus Ferguson happening with separate but equal, which I've already mentioned. And so a lot of it's kind of 2 steps forward but 5 steps backwards, and we go back into um, racial racial forms of systemic racism, I would say. Oh, and speaking of systemic racism, so then we have, if we jump forward to where we are today, so the textbook takes you to current examples of what Black communities and the Black societies are dealing with. So we have incarceration because of the Jim Crow laws. You end up having a large amount of Black males being arrested, and it's connected with a lot of drug crimes, and there's harsher penalties if you are caught with a certain form of drug versus another one. And crack specifically was very much associated with the Black community. And so you find a new way to incarcerate and then get cheap labor from those that are in prison. And then you have systemic racism occurring within health, and, and Black women in particular, that especially in terms of pregnancy and birth, that the rates in terms of who has a life versus uh, uh, the tragic, either a baby not making it or the mother themselves dying, that Black patients in general are more than twice as likely to die than white patients. And so then it brings up questions about what kinds of health care people are receiving based on their racial dynamics or how they are racially perceived. And then, of course, educational inequality in terms of schooling. So separate but equal gets overturned with Brown versus Board of Education. But then uh, we still have today, sorry about that, I don't know why the clock is coming up. We still have today segregated communities in which certain school districts have more money than others. And so and even in different levels of education. So if you look here at this quote, in 2000, 15% of 26 to 30-year-old African American women had graduated from college compared to about 33% of white women of the same age. So it's twice as many. Um, and so what's going on educationally? How are we failing our students based on their demographics in terms of their experiences? And it can also be tied up with affirmative action. It was a way to counter the discrimination in the lots of different areas, in workplaces, in education. My mom, being the first to receive a degree, was able to get a scholarship due to affirmative action, which allowed UCLA to increase its diversity through specific scholarships targeting those that weren't represented in the university setting. And when affirmative action was overturned, then you wonder what's that doing in terms of representation. Are we still getting a higher percentage of certain demographics within universities or community colleges or state colleges? So this is a really interesting one to read slowly, especially if you're interested. I would say, like, in terms of uh, Latino representation at the PhD level, I believe the number is still like 2% or less. And so, what's going on that we have such a smaller number of professors that earn PhDs in our communities? And then the chapter ends, I believe this is the last section, on cultural and political representation. So there's some really good um, explanations in terms of images and stereotypes of Black women in media and Blacks in general. in terms of what what or how they're portrayed. And this article in particular is one that is worth looking at in terms of the reference in the sources cited. Um, there's five here that are mentioned: the mammy, the matriarch, the welfare mother, the black beggar, the Jezebel Hoochie, and you can see some images of the mammy figure or mammy dolls, and what it means when these kinds of stereotypes continue, regardless of whether they're true or not, and how does that change the way a community might view a black, a dominant community might view a black community. And again, there's some examples of film and literature that are mentioned, and then we get into Black Lives Matter as you're coming forward with more contemporary uh, examples of what's going on. Black feminism, Sojourner Truth, the Ain't I a Woman speech, really important and really, really big. I would read this section very slowly because it's very important. And then reach out if you have any questions. And then finally, the chapter ends with the conclusion, the key terms, and then and with all the definitions. And then if you go one more page, you can see the references that I was talking about. So I spent a long time on this chapter, so I'm going to do the intersectionality chapters separate. Please reach out if you have any questions. Thank you.